The city outside was a river of light, a constant humming flow of taxis and late workers. But inside Vesper, the world was still and thick as velvet. The air smelled of old money, lemon polish, and the faint, sweet scent of the white orchids that stood like silent sentinels in the corners. This was a place where sound was absorbed by Persian rugs and damask wallpaper, where a whispered conversation carried further than a shout ever could. He owned this quiet. Arlen Thorne sat in his usual chair, a wingback throne of deep oxblood, leather positioned not in the center of the room, but where he could see everything: the door, the bar, the famous Bissendorfer piano gleaming under a single low spotlight. He was a man built from angles and silence, his hair a sweep of steel gray, his eyes the cool, assessing color of a winter sea. His wealth was so vast, it had ceased to be about numbers and had become a kind of atmosphere, a force that made people lean in when he spoke and hold their breath when he was still. Tonight, the room held a few of those people. 3 associates, each powerful in their own realms of finance and media, were scattered on low sofas. The meeting, such as it was, had concluded an hour ago. Now it was just the quiet hum of men who were too used to winning, with nothing left to conquer for the evening. Boredom in a place like Vesper was a subtle but dangerous thing. She moved through this scene like a ghost, the new server. She'd only been there a few weeks. The manager had said she was reliable, discreet, and had good hands, meaning she didn't clink the crystal. She was fine, in the way expensive, but plain wallpaper is fine. She didn't draw the eye, which was the highest praise a server at Vesper could receive. But Thorne saw things others missed. It was how he'd built an empire from lines of code. He noticed patterns, tiny cracks in the ordinary. He'd noticed her hands. They were efficient hands, sure. They cleared plates without a sound, placed a fresh glass of Macallan before him before he'd even thought to glance at his own. But earlier, when she'd set down his coaster, the light from the table lamp had caught her fingertips. Across the pads of her right hand, and curling around the side of her left, were pale, faded ridges, calluses, not the kind from hard labor, but specific, polished ones, familiar ones. He watched her now as she stood by the service door, waiting. Her posture was perfectly attentive, but her gaze was far away, lost in the dark, reflective surface of the piano lid. It was a look he recognized. It was the look of someone calculating a difficult problem, or remembering a tune, one of his guests. A man with a loud laugh and a quiet desperation to seem important was telling a long story about a golf course in Scotland. The other 2 were feigning interest. The boredom deepened, turning the air syrupy. Thorne didn't decide to speak so much as allow the words to leave him. He didn't raise his voice. In Vesper, you never had to. You. The single word cut through the golf story. The storyteller stopped, mid-swing. Everyone looked at Thorne, then followed his gaze to the server. She started, pulled from her thoughts, and met his eyes. There was a flicker there, not fear, but a quick, wary alertness. You play, he stated. It wasn't a question. A slight flush crept up her neck. I used to, sir, a long time ago. He gestured with 2 fingers, a tiny motion toward the magnificent piano. Play now. Entertain us. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet of before. This was a held breath. The other men looked from Thorne to the girl, small smiles playing on their lips. A diversion had presented itself. She didn't move. Sir, I'm working, and I'm out of practice. Consider this part of your work, Thorne said, his voice flat and cool. The ambience is lacking. Fix it. He let the implication hang, heavy as the chandelier. Her job, her generous tips, the fragile new start this position represented, it all balanced on this moment. On his whim, he saw the calculation in her eyes. The swift, internal weighing of pride against practicality. He'd seen it in boardrooms 100 times. The practicality always won. Slowly, she set down the linen towel she'd been holding. She walked toward the piano, her sensible black shoes making no sound on the rug. She looked smaller under the spotlight. She didn't sit immediately. For a second, she just looked at the keys, and in that moment, she seemed like someone visiting a grave. Then she sat, adjusted the bench with a quiet scrape that echoed, and laid her hands in her lap. The men on the sofas shifted, turning their bodies toward her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and mild amusement. They were expecting a halting chopsticks, maybe a simple nursery rhyme. A cute, clumsy break in the monotony. She took a deep, slow breath that seemed to draw the tension from her shoulders. When she raised her hands, the faded calluses found their home. Her posture changed. The hesitant server was gone, replaced by a figure of focus dot. Her first notes were not timid. They were clear, precise, and filled the room. It was a piece by Chopin, a nocturne. It was beautiful in a technical, textbook way. Every note was correct. The timing was perfect. It was like listening to a very good recording. The loud guest nodded approvingly. "Lovely," he murmured, and took a sip of his brandy. The spell was broken. The music became background, a classy soundtrack. One man pulled out his phone, discreetly checking the screen under the table. Another leaned over and resumed a conversation about stock futures in a low voice. The pianist was doing her job providing ambience. She was a human music box, wound up by the billionaire. Thorne watched her. He didn't listen to the music. He analyzed the player. Her face was a mask of concentration, but her eyes were flat. She was playing from memory, from muscle, but not from feeling. She was giving him exactly what he'd asked for, nothing more. It was a form of resistance, he realized. A quiet, perfect rebellion. By playing so technically, so emotionlessly, she was obeying his command while showing him how empty it was. This annoyed him. He hadn't asked for competence. He had asked for a solution to his boredom, and this was not it. This was just noise with better pedigree. The final chord of the nocturne faded. There was a smattering of polite, absent-minded applause from the sofas. She made to stand. "Again," Thorne said. She froze, half risen. She looked at him. "You heard me. Play something else." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Let's see if you know more than party tricks." The challenge was clear. The room's attention, which had wandered, snapped back. This was becoming more interesting. The other men now watched, not the piano, but the dynamic between the owner and the player. A small, cruel game was beginning. She sat back down. The mask was still on, but a crack had appeared, a tiny flicker of something hot in her eyes. Resentment. Good, Thorne thought. Feel something. Then play it. Her second piece was faster, a batch prelude. It was a river of notes, tumbling over one another with dizzying speed. It was harder, showier. It demanded attention through difficulty. And for a minute, it worked. The men watched, impressed by the dexterity, the sheer physical effort. But as the complexity continued, it became just that, a display of effort. Once they understood she could do it, the novelty wore off. The man with the phone gave up pretending and started typing. Thorne finished his drink. The ice clinked, a shockingly loud sound in the middle of the flowing music. She flinched, just a micro movement in her shoulders, but she didn't miss a note. The song ended. This time, no one applauded. Before she could even move, Thorne spoke. His voice was calm, conversational, and it cut deeper than any shout. Faster music doesn't mean better music. It just means you're running from the silence and from the feeling. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on her profile. "You're playing notes. I asked to be entertained. There is a difference. Show me you understand it. The other guests exchanged glances. This was no longer just a command. It was a dissection. He was peeling back her skill, layer by layer, looking for something he hadn't found yet. The air wasn't just quiet now. It was charged, uncomfortable. The server was trapped on the bench, under the light, and the only way out was through a song that would satisfy a man who seemed impossible to satisfy. She looked down at her hands. Those capable, calloused hands resting on the ivory keys. The first real crack appeared in her composure. Her breath hitched just once. The polished, emotionless performer was fading, and what was left underneath looked young and tired and very, very human. She didn't look at Thorne. She simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and placed her fingers back on the keys, ready for the next demand. The game, it seemed, was far from over. The polite veil of the evening had been torn away. The request to play had become something else, a trial, a public examination. The three men on the sofas were now fully invested, their earlier boredom forgotten. They had become an audience to a different kind of performance, not of music, but of power. The server sat at the piano, her back to them, a slim figure outlined by the spotlight. The expectant silence wasn't kind. It was heavy, waiting to see if she would break. The man with the loud laugh, the one who told the golf story, was the first to speak into that silence. He had a round, cheerful face that didn't match the glint in his eye. "Batch is all well and good," he said, his voice too loud for the room. "But it's a bit like a math problem, isn't it? All correct angles. Let's hear something with a bit of passion. What about Beethoven? The Moonlight Sonata? First movement." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a test, thrown down like a gauntlet. The famous somber piece. Everyone knew it, or thought they did. It would be easy to judge. She didn't turn. She didn't speak. She simply took a breath that lifted her shoulders and let it out slowly. Then she began. The familiar, haunting triplet pattern filled the room, the bass notes a deep, mournful pulse. She played it well. Too well, perhaps. It was polished, the dynamics carefully observed, the tempo perfect. But it felt like a museum piece under glass, beautiful, revered, and utterly lifeless. Halfway through, the man chuckled, not unkindly, but with a note of victory. "See? Technical. Correct. But where's the moonlight? Where's the heartache?" He looked at his friends. "I told you. It's just notes." A flush, hot and dark, crept up the back of the server's neck, visible above her simple black collar. Her fingers pressed a little harder into a chord. The second guest, a lean man with sharp glasses who had been silent until now, leaned forward. His voice was softer, more analytical. "The problem is the environment," he said, as if she weren't there. "She's performing under duress. It's a controlled experiment with predictable results. No emotional data can be retrieved under these conditions." He steepled his fingers. "Let's increase the variables. Something faster, more complex. See if the pressure reveals a flaw." Debussy's Clair de Lune. It was a cruel choice. To go from one moonlight piece to another, more impressionistic and technically treacherous one. It was a request designed to trip her up. For the first time, she hesitated. Her hands, which had moved with surety, hovered for a second over the keys. The hesitation was like a splash of cold water to the men watching. They saw the crack, the uncertainty. The lean man smiled a thin smile. She began. The Debussy was a different beast, flowing, shimmering, full of pedal and delicate right-hand work. It was the sound of light on water. Or it should have been. Here, it was tense. A wrong note here, a rushed phrase there. It wasn't a disaster, but it was a stumble. The perfect facade was crumbling. The third guest, the youngest of them, had been watching with a strange intensity. He wasn't smiling. He seemed almost uncomfortable, but carried along by the current of the game. When the last shimmering note of the Debussy faded into an awkward quiet, he spoke up. This is silly. We're just barking orders." He tried to sound light, but it fell flat. He looked at the server's rigid back, then at Thorne, who was observing it all like a scientist at a lab window. "I don't know. Make it a bet, then. Make it interesting." Thorne finally moved. He lifted his hand, a small gesture that commanded the room. A fresh glass of whiskey had appeared at his elbow, brought by another server who moved like a shadow. "A bet," Thorne echoed, his voice low. "An excellent idea." His Wintersea eyes fixed on the woman at the piano. "You have 10 minutes. Play whatever they ask. If you complete each piece to the satisfaction of the asker, you keep your job and you get a bonus. A significant one. $1,000 for every piece you play without error." The number hung in the air. For a server, even in this place, it was a staggering sum. The men murmured, their interest sharpening into something greedier. But Thorne continued, and the word was like a trap snapping shut. For every mistake, a wrong note, a missed tempo, any error, my guests note $100 is deducted. If you refuse to play a requested piece, you forfeit it all, can leave tonight. Do you understand the terms? It was no longer just a command. It was a transaction. He had quantified her humiliation, her skill, her desperation. He had turned her into a stock ticker, her value rising and falling with every note. She was trembling now. A fine, almost invisible shake in her hands as they lay in her lap. She was staring down at the black and white keys as if they were teeth. She was cornered. To walk away was to lose everything, to admit defeat. To stay was to be bought piece by piece. She gave a single tight nod. The room changed. The atmosphere became charged, predatory. The first man, the loud one, rubbed his hands together. "Right. Let's see the ledger. Rachmaninoff. Something with big chords. Let's see if those hands are as strong as they look." And so it began. For the next half hour, the grand piano became an instrument of torture. They threw titles at her like darts. A furious Mozart sonata. A lyrical, deceptively simple Schubert impromptu. A jazzy Gershwin prelude. They were digging through the classical catalog, trying to find the gap in her knowledge, a weakness in her fingers. She played. And she played well. The promise of money, or the threat of its loss, or maybe just a deep, stubborn pride, locked her in. The mistakes from the Debussy vanished. She was playing not with feeling, but with a fierce, desperate precision. Her face was pale, a sheen of sweat on her temple under the hot light. Her breaths were controlled, but quick. The men kept score. Ooh, that transition was shaky. Deduct 100. The loud one would crow. The tempo dragged in the second section. Another 100, the analytical one would state coolly. The younger one just watched, his earlier discomfort returning, but he didn't call out any mistakes. He just sat, looking increasingly unhappy. Thorne said nothing. He just watched the numbers dance in his head. He watched her. He saw the cost of each piece in the tight line of her jaw, in the way she blinked too fast between songs. She was giving him exactly what he'd wanted, a display of bought and paid for talent. But the strange, hollow feeling in his own chest didn't go away. The boredom had been replaced by something colder, more metallic dot during a brief lull. As she wiped her palms on her black trousers, the analytical man spoke. It's remarkable, in a way, like watching a very advanced player piano. The notes are all there. The programming is excellent. But the source code, it's hollow. There's no narrative, no person in it. His words landed in the quiet room. They weren't meant for her to hear, but she did. She flinched as if struck. The loud man laughed. Who cares about the person? Look at the hands go. It's a spectacle. Here, play that famous one, the fast Turkish one by Mozart. Let's see some speed. She played the Rondo alla Turca. It was a whirlwind of notes, cheerful and bombastic on the surface. She played it with blinding speed, a mechanical frenzy. It was technically dazzling. It was also completely joyless. The music that was meant to be playful and bright sounded frantic, desperate, like someone running. When the final, pounding chords ended, there was a moment of pure exhaustion. Her shoulders slumped. The clock on the wall showed she had 2 minutes left of Thorne's cruel 10. The younger guest couldn't take it anymore. All right, that's enough, he said, his voice strained. This is enough. She's played everything you've thrown at her. Thorne ignored him. His eyes were on the server. She looked emptied out. The fight, the precision, the last of her professional pride, it had all been spent on that frantic Turkish march. She was a shell on the bench. One more, Thorne said, his voice quiet but absolute. The time is not yet up. One final request. He let the silence build, let her dread grow. Then he gestured, not to his guests, but vaguely at the air. Play something of your own choosing. Not from their list. Not from the canon. Play what you would play if no one was listening. If there was no bonus and no penalty. He paused, letting the irony sink in. Let's see what your taste is. Let's see what's left when the machine stops following commands. It was the cruelest request of all. After breaking her down piece by piece, after turning her art into a circus act, he was now asking for something real. He was asking her to open a door she had clearly locked shut a long time ago. He was asking her to be vulnerable after making sure she was completely defenseless. She didn't move. She didn't even seem to breathe. The men on the sofas were utterly still, sensing a shift. This was no longer a bet. This was something else. Slowly, very slowly, she lifted her head. She wasn't looking at Thorne, or at the wealthy men. Her gaze was turned toward the dark corner of the room, near the service door, as if someone stood there in the shadows. Her eyes were glistening, but her face was set. Her hands rose. They were no longer trembling. They were steady, but they looked different. They weren't the weapons of a performer under siege anymore. They looked like the hands of someone coming home after a very long, very hard journey. She placed them gently on the keys, and the room waited. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the city, a distant, muffled hum through the thick glass. The spotlight on the piano felt hotter than before, a circle of judgment. The men on the sofas had forgotten their drinks. They had forgotten the bets. They were watching a person at the edge of a cliff, wondering if she would jump or simply turn to stone. Her hands rested on the keys, but they did not press down. They were just resting there, as if drawing warmth from the ivory, or perhaps saying a quiet goodbye. Her gaze was still fixed on that dark corner of the room, seeing something none of them could see. The analytical man opened his mouth, perhaps to make another comment about delayed reaction times, but a look from Thorne, a sharp, silencing flicker of his eyes, made him close it again. Something in the air had changed. The power had subtly shifted, leaking away from the audience and pooling around a woman on the bench. She closed her eyes. Not a flinch, but a deliberate, slow closing, like someone stepping into a private room and shutting the door behind them. When she opened them again, they were different. The wariness, the fear, the calculation, it was all gone. In its place was a deep, settled sadness, and beneath that, a strength that had nothing to do with the men in the room. Her fingers moved, not with the explosive energy of the Turkish march, nor the careful precision of the Beethoven. They simply settled into a position, and she pressed down. A single note rang out. It was a middle C, played so softly it was almost a thought rather than a sound. It hung in the quiet, pure and alone. Then another note, a third above it, then a gentle, wandering descent down a simple scale that wasn't a scale at all. It was a sigh. It was the musical sound of someone letting go of a breath they'd been holding for years. This was no piece they recognized. There was no famous melody, no complex structure you could put a name to. It was something being built, note by note, right in front of them. A left-hand pattern emerged, a slow, rolling walk of deep bass notes that felt like a heartbeat, steady and patient. Over the top, her right hand began to trace a melody. It was not cheerful. It was not showy. It was simply true dot. It spoke of gray mornings and empty rooms. It spoke of a phone that never rang, and the particular silence that follows a hope finally dying. The melody would climb, tentative and fragile, reaching for something beautiful, only to fall back, curling in on itself with a gentle, aching resolution. It was the sound of loneliness, but not a pitiful one. A chosen loneliness. A quiet space. The loud man shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. He wanted to say something, to break the spell, but the music was like a hand on his chest, holding him still. He looked at his friends. The analytical man was no longer analyzing. He was just listening, his head tilted, his sharp eyes softened by confusion. The younger man was staring at his hands in his lap, as if ashamed. Thorne felt it most of all. The cold, metallic feeling in his chest was being replaced by something else, something unfamiliar and unsettling. He was a man who dealt in abstract data, trends, percentages. This was not abstract. This was a raw, direct line into a heart. He had commanded a performance, and instead, he was being given a confession. He tried to listen as a critic, to find the technical flaws, the simplistic structure. But he couldn't. The music bypassed his brain and went straight to a place he rarely visited. The song changed. The left-hand heartbeat grew a little stronger, a little more insistent. The right-hand melody, which had been so sorrowful, began to find fragments of light. A series of higher notes, like sunlight breaking through clouds for just a second before disappearing. A brief, surprising run that was almost playful, a memory of joy so sharp it was painful. She wasn't just playing notes anymore. She was telling a story without words. A story of loss, yes, but also of what came after the loss. The slow, painful process of putting one foot in front of the other. Of finding that you could still make a cup of tea, still read a book, still breathe, even with the hole inside you. Her body moved with the music now, not with the stiff control of before, but with a natural flow. A slight sway of her shoulders, a tilt of her head as she leaned into a particularly tender phrase. She was no longer in Vesper. She was somewhere else entirely. And against their will, the men in the room were taken there with her. The melody began to climb again, but this time it didn't fall back. It gathered the fragments of light, the memories of joy, the strength from that steady, patient heartbeat in the bass. It wove them together. The music swelled, not in volume, but in emotion. It became a soaring, defiant statement. It wasn't a happy ending. The ache was still there, woven into the very fabric of the sound, but it was a declaration. A declaration that the human spirit is not erased by grief. It is changed by it, shaped by it, and can eventually sing again with a deeper, more complex voice. Tears, completely unexpected, welled in the eyes of the younger guest. He wiped them away roughly, embarrassed, but he couldn't look away. The analytical man had taken off his glasses and was pinching the bridge of his nose. The loud man sat perfectly still, his face unreadable. Thorne was lost. The walls of his club, the value of his whiskey, the weight of his wealth, it all felt like stage props, flimsy and fake, compared to the reality being spun from the piano. He had spent the evening trying to quantify her, to break her down into components of skill and error. And she had responded by presenting him with a soul, whole and unbreakable. He felt a shocking, hollow shame. He had been trying to crack a walnut with a sledgehammer, only to discover it held a galaxy inside. The song began its return. The soaring melody descended, gently, like someone being lowered to the ground after a flight. It returned to fragments of the original sighing theme, but it was different now. Transformed. The sadness was still present, but it was at peace with the beauty. The last few notes were a series of quiet, resolved chords, each one landing softly, like a footstep on a path leading home. The final chord faded. The last vibration hummed in the strings and then was gone, absorbed by the velvet and the silence. And the silence this time was total. It was not the quiet of boredom, or of anticipation, or of cruelty. It was a deep, reverent, stunned silence. The world outside the city seemed to have stopped. No one moved. No one breathed. The server kept her hands on the keys, her head bowed as if praying, or perhaps just gathering the pieces of herself she had just laid bare. A single crystalline sound broke the spell. A tear from the younger guest had escaped and fallen into his empty glass. Plink, it was like a signal. The loud man let out a long, shuddering breath he didn't seem to know he'd been holding. The analytical man slowly put his glasses back on, his movements careful, as if afraid to make a noise. Thorne looked at the woman. He saw the slight tremble in her shoulders now, the aftermath of such an emotional expenditure. He saw the way the light caught the single track of moisture on her cheek. He saw, finally, not a server, not a pianist, but a person. A person who had just done something braver than any deal he had ever brokered. He tried to find words. A critique? An appraisal? That was. He began, but his voice, usually so sure, was a dry rasp. It failed him. There were no words in his vocabulary for what he had just heard. All the language of business and power was useless here. She moved. Slowly, she lifted her hands from the keyboard. She didn't slam the lid. She didn't stand up dramatically. She simply pushed the bench back with a soft scrape, the sound shockingly loud in the quiet room. She stood up. She turned to face them. Her face was pale, exhausted, but utterly calm. Her eyes were clear. She looked at each of the guests, meeting their gazes without challenge, without pleading. She saved Thorne for last. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw no anger, no triumph, no expectation. He saw only a profound and weary understanding, as if she had seen straight through his money and his gains to the small, bored man at the center of it all. She didn't speak. She didn't wait for his verdict, for the scoring of this final, impossible piece. She just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod not to him, but to the piano, to the song that was now gone. Then she turned and walked, not with hurried escape, but with a quiet, exhausted dignity, across the Persian rug, past the staring men, and through the service door. It swung shut behind her with a soft, final click, leaving behind a room full of wealthy, powerful men who had never, in their entire lives, felt so poor. The silence after the door clicked shut was a living thing. It filled the space with a music had been thick and heavy, like a fog you could taste. The air itself felt different, used up, charged with an energy that had nowhere to go. The loud man was the first to try and break it. He cleared his throat, a rough, awkward sound. "Well," he said, and the word fell to the floor like a stone. He tried to smile, to summon back the jovial mask from earlier in the evening. It wouldn't stick. His face just twitched. He looked down at his hands, then over at the empty piano bench, as if expecting to see a ghost still sitting there. That was Something else. It was the most honest thing he'd said all night. The analytical man didn't speak. He had poured himself a fresh drink with a hand that was not quite steady. The ice cubes clinked violently against the crystal. He drank it in one long gulp, not savoring it, just trying to wash something away. He kept looking at the closed service door, his mind clearly racing, but for once it seemed he had no framework, no data set to file this experience into. He had dissected a performance and found a soul, and it had broken his tools. The younger man just sat with his face in his hands. His shoulders were hunched. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. He didn't try to hide it. "We shouldn't have done that," he whispered, not to anyone in particular. That was. We were animals. He stood up abruptly, the movement jerky. "I need some air." He didn't look at Thorne. He just walked, almost stumbled, towards the club's main entrance, pushing through the heavy door and out into the night, leaving it slightly ajar. A whisper of traffic noise and cool air seeped in, but it did nothing to clear the room. All of this happened on the edges of Thorne's awareness. He was still in the chair, his body rigid. He was staring at the spot where she had stood, where she had turned and looked at him. That look, it wasn't hate. It was worse. It was understanding. It was as if she had taken an X-ray of the entire evening, of his entire life, and found the hollow center. And she had pitied him. The feeling in his chest was not one he could name. It was a cold, spreading numbness, edged with a sharp, sickening shame. He had commanded a circus, and a priest had walked in and given a sermon. He had been measuring worth in dollars and errors, and she had introduced a currency he didn't deal in: truth. He replayed the last hour in his mind. The commands, the bets, a smug commentary. Each memory was like a small, bright pinprick of humiliation. He saw not a powerful man entertaining his friends, but a spoiled child throwing rocks at a stained glass window. Shocked when the light poured through the broken pieces, his eyes drifted to the piano. The spotlight on it seemed sacred now, a shrine. He thought of her hands, those capable, calloused hands, not hammering out showpieces anymore, but gently pulling a raw, beautiful truth from the air. He thought of the music. It wasn't just a song. It was a map of a person's pain and survival. And he had made her pay a toll to show it to him. Thorne. It was the analytical man. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual confidence. What was that? Who is she? Thorne didn't answer. He didn't know. That was the whole terrible point. He had owned the space she worked in, controlled the terms of her employment, believed he could summon her talent like a function on a spreadsheet. And he had never once known who she was. He had never asked. The loud man stood up, adjusting his jacket, trying to reassemble his persona. "A hell of a party trick," he said, but the bravado was thin, transparent. "Gets the waterworks going. Probably something she plays to get big tips." He was trying to downgrade it, to put it back in a box he could understand. A transaction. But even he didn't sound like he believed it. "No," the analytical man said, shaking his head slowly. "No, that wasn't a trick. That was an exposure. You don't use that to get tips. You hide that. You protect it." He looked at Thorne. "We asked for a machine. She showed us she wasn't one. It was a rebuttal. A rebuttal. The word hung there. She hadn't argued. She hadn't refused. She had simply played their game to its end, and then changed the rules entirely. And Thorne finally moved. He stood up. His legs felt strange, as if they weren't entirely his own. He walked toward the piano, his footsteps silent on the deep rug. The other two men watched him. Unsure he stopped in front of the grand Biesendorfer. He reached out a hand, hesitated, then let his fingertips brush the smooth, cool wood of its lid. He had bought this instrument at auction for the price of a sports car. It was an investment, a piece of the atmosphere, a status symbol. He now understood it was just a box of wood and wire. She was the instrument, and for a few minutes, something profound had been played through her. He thought of the bonus, the $1,000 per song, the deductions for errors. The concept was so vile to him now he almost winced. To attach a dollar figure to that song would be an act of violence. It would be like pricing a sunset dot. He turned from the piano. His gaze swept the room, the empty sofas, the half-finished drinks, the closed door through which she had left. The club, his sanctuary of control, felt alien. It felt like a beautifully decorated cage. "The evening is over," Thorne said. His voice was flat, empty. The two men didn't need to be told twice. The loud man nodded, grabbing his coat. The analytical man just gave a last, long look at the piano and followed. They left without another word, their usual farewells stuck in their throats. The main door closed behind them, sealing Thorne in the tomb-like quiet. He was alone, utterly alone. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, the silence was unbearable. It wasn't peaceful. It was accusatory. It echoed with the ghost of her music and highlighted the absolute emptiness of everything else. He walked slowly to the service door. He pushed it open. The light from the main room spilled into a narrow, plain hallway with concrete floors and fluorescent lights. It was the reality behind the velvet curtain. He saw a small break room with a chipped table, a time clock on the wall, lockers. The manager, a nervous man in a tight suit, appeared from an office. "Sir, is everything all right?" "The server, she just left. She clocked out. I told her she couldn't just—" Thorne held up a hand. The manager fell silent. "Her file," Thorne said. "The new server. Bring it to me, now." The manager scurried away and returned with a simple folder. Thorne took it, not back into the club, but into the sterile break room. He sat at the chipped table and opened it under the harsh light. There was a standard application. A name, an address in a part of the city he never visited. A short list of previous jobs. A diner, a music library, a community arts center. Under other skills training, a single understated line, classical piano. 15 years of study. 15 years. He thought of the calluses. He thought of the muscle memory that had powered through Mozart and Rachmaninoff on command. 15 years of study, leading to a chipped table in a break room. Paper clipped to the back was a single faded photocopy. It was a short review from a small, local newspaper, dated years ago. The headline read, "Young pianist shows startling depth." There was a blurry photo of a much younger woman, her face bright with a different kind of light, standing beside a piano at what looked like a school auditorium. The review spoke of rare emotional intuition and a promising future. The final sentence was, "One listens and feels in the presence of a true artist in the making." Thorne put the paper down. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. The promise, the future, the diner, the community center, the server's uniform, the bets. He had not just compelled a server to play piano. He had taken the final fragile remnant of that artist in the making, the last private sacred piece of her, and had forced it to perform for his bored friends. And she had done it. She had shown them the artist anyway, not in spite of his cruelty, but by channeling every bit of it into the music. He closed the folder. The shame was complete now, a physical weight. He had believed he was the most powerful person in the room. He knew now, with absolute certainty, that he had been wrong. The most powerful thing in the room had been the truth in that song, and she had taken it with her when she left. He had no idea what to do next. But sitting in that break room, under the buzzing light, the billionaire knew one thing for sure. The world, his world, could not go back to the way it was 5 minutes ago. Something had broken, and it wasn't her. The night passed in a long, slow crawl. Thorne did not go to his penthouse. He stayed in the club, moving through the empty rooms like a ghost in his own domain. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a presence. It replayed the evening on a loop, the commands, the smug laughter, the final devastating silence after her song. He sat at the bar, then in his leather chair, then finally back at the chip table in the break room, her file open before him. The words "artist in the making" seemed to pulse on the page, an accusation. When the first gray light of dawn stained the windows, he was still there. He had made a decision. It wasn't a grand plan, and it wasn't born from guilt alone. It was more like a course correction, the first logical step in a problem he finally understood he had created. He took the address from the file. It was an apartment building in a neighborhood of old brick and fire escapes, a world away from the glass and steel of his own. He went himself. No driver. He left the luxury car a block away and walked, the morning air cold and damp, smelling of coffee and exhaust. The building was what his analysts would call unremarkable. He stood outside for a long time, feeling utterly out of place. What was he doing here? What could he possibly say? The confidence that usually armored him was gone. He was just a man on a cracked sidewalk. He didn't go up. Instead, he found a small, tired-looking cafe across the street. He took a seat by the window, ordering a coffee he didn't drink. He watched the building's entrance. He told himself he was being strategic, waiting for the right moment. But the truth was, he was afraid. Just after 9, she came out. She was dressed in simple jeans and a worn sweater, a canvas bag over her shoulder. She looked tired, but also calm. There was no sign of the storm from the night before on her face. She just looked like a person starting her day. She walked down the street, not with the hurry of someone going to a job, but with a kind of purposeful stillness. He left too much money on the cafe table and followed, keeping a distance. She walked for several blocks to a small fenced park. She went not to a bench, but to a neglected public gazebo. Inside, covered by a tarp, was an old, out-of-tune upright piano, its paint peeling. She pulled off the tarp, sat on the rickety stool, and opened the lid. And then, for no one but herself, and the empty park and the pigeons, she began to play dot. It was a simple exercise. Scales, arpeggios. Then the same aching, beautiful fragment of the original song she had played at the club. She worked on it, tweaking a note here, a chord there. This was not a performance. This was practice. This was the work. This was where the magic came from, not from spotlights and pressure, but from quiet dedication in the cold morning air. Dot Thorne watched from behind a tree, unseen. The last of his illusions shattered. He had thought the song at the club was a finished thing, a relic she pulled out. But it wasn't. It was alive. It was still being born. He was witnessing something more private than anything he'd seen the night before. This was the artist, alone with her craft. He turned and walked away, back to his car. He knew now that any grand gesture, any attempt to fix things from his world, would be another violation. He couldn't buy her a concert hall. He couldn't offer her a record deal. Those were his solutions, his language. They would just be another form of command. He went back to Vesper. The day staff were cleaning, their voices hushed. He went to his office, a room of sleek screens and silent efficiency. He did not call his lawyers or his financial managers. He picked up the phone and made a call to a different kind of expert, a master piano tuner and restorer, the best in the city. 3 days later, in the cold, clear dawn, a discreet van pulled up to the little park. The tuner, an older man with careful hands, and two assistants went to the gazebo. With reverence, they worked on the old upright. They replaced broken hammers, fixed sticky keys, meticulously tuned every string until the instrument, while still bearing its scars, sang true for the first time in decades. They left a simple, waterproof cover and a new padded bench. Tucked under the bench was a sealed envelope. On the front, it said only, "For the maintenance of the instrument." Inside was a cashier's check, enough to pay for tuning and minor repairs for the next 20 years. There was no name, no return address, no signature. Thorne also called his club manager. His instructions were simple. The server was to be kept on the payroll at her full wage with full benefits for the next 3 months. She was not required to come in. It was a paid leave. "Tell her it's a sabbatical," Thorne said, his voice leaving no room for discussion. "Tell her the club is reviewing its service protocols." It was a lie, but a gentle one of space, bought with his money but free from his presence. He did not go back to the park. He didn't try to see her again. But he began, in small, strange ways, to change. The next gathering at Vesper was quieter. When a new, young intern brought him charts, fumbling nervously, Thorne didn't coldly critique. He simply said, "Take your time." The words felt foreign in his mouth. He found himself listening more, not just to words, but to the silence between them. One afternoon, a week later, he was in his office. The door opened, and the manager stepped in, looking anxious. "Sir, she's here." The server. "She's asking to see you." Thorne's heart did something strange, a lurch that was not about power or control. He nodded. "Send her in." She entered. She was not in her server's uniform. She wore the same simple clothes from the park. She carried her canvas bag. She looked around the office, not with awe, but with a quiet observation. Then her eyes settled on him. "The piano in the park," she said. Her voice was calm, clear. "That was you." It wasn't a question. He nodded. "Yes, and the paid leave." "Yes." She was silent for a moment, studying him. She wasn't angry. She wasn't grateful. She was assessing. Why? Thorne stood up from his desk. He didn't come around it. He kept the distance between them. He struggled for the right words, the true words. "Because I was wrong," he said finally. The admission was surprisingly simple. "I treated something precious like a toy. I tried to put a price on something that has none. I can't unhear what I heard. And I couldn't do nothing." She absorbed this. She walked over to the large window that overlooked the city. The piano tuner left a check. A very large one. "It's for the piano, not for you," he said quickly. The instrument should be worthy of the music. A faint, almost smile touched her lips, but didn't stay. She turned back to him. "I didn't come for thanks. And I'm not here to forgive you. That's not mine to give. It's yours to earn from yourself." Her words were like a cool, clear glass of water. They held no malice, only truth. "I know," he said. "I won't be coming back to work here," she said. "The sabbatical? That's kind. But I need a clean break." He had expected this. "I understand." She shifted her bag on her shoulder. "The song I played that night, I've been working on it for a long time. It's for my father. He was my teacher. He died before he could hear it finished." She said it plainly, not for sympathy, just as a statement of fact. "You asked for something real." That's what it was. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place for Thorne. The private grief, the defiant love in the music. He had been a bystander at a sacred rite. He just nodded, humbled beyond speech. She walked toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the handle. She didn't look back. That piano in the park? It sounds good now. Really good. Thank you for that. And then she was gone. Thorne stood in his silent, expensive office. He did not feel like a billionaire. He felt like a student who had just passed a brutal, important exam, one he hadn't known he was taking. He didn't feel happy. He felt quiet. He felt clear. He walked out of his office, through the empty club. He went to the Grand Bissendorfer. He didn't sit. He just laid a hand on its lid. He thought of the tuned upright in the park, and the woman who would play it in the mornings, for no one and for everyone. He thought of the song that was both an ending and a beginning. He had tried to compel a server. In return, she had, without ever intending to, compelled a man to remember he was human. The debt, he understood, was entirely his. And for the first time, he was at peace with a balance he could never truly repay. The music had stopped, but the melody, for him, would now forever continue.